We are back on Morning Line. Thanks for joining us. Our guests with us this morning from Mental Health America in the Mid-South, and that is Lynn Wood. She's down at the bottom of the screen, and above her is Tom Starling, the CEO. Lynn's a caregiver support specialist, and taking your phone calls. As you see, we're talking about dealing with the holidays and some of our older loved ones, especially. Many of you are caregivers and need assistance on that. We've got another caller that waited through the break, you two. Let's take Ronnie real quick. Ronnie, good morning. Hi, Ronnie.
Good morning.
Good morning, Ronnie.
I got a question. You said you're going to mail your parents a package?
Well, it's going to be my parents, and I'm going to mail it to my aunt as well.
Okay. And if they're in a nursing home, make sure you kind of, make sure they get it, because I mailed some stuff to my mother-in-law, and she never did receive it, and it never did come back to me like I had my address on it. It didn't even come back. If you mail them pictures, make sure you got copies, because if you mail them and they don't get them, you lost them.
That's a good point. I don't know if the problem on your end was the post office or if it was the facility you sent it to, but that's a really good point. Whenever you send anything, you need to be sure, and that's the tricky thing. I don't live near my folks. They live in Boise, Idaho, but my brother's there, and so what I may end up doing is send it to him, and he can take it over there personally. But I hear what Ronnie's saying. I mean, making sure you can get what you want to get to your loved ones if they're in these facilities that are basically locked up, right? So if there's a caregiver kind of trying to supervise a loved one that's in a locked up facility because of COVID, what do you suggest, Lynn? Skype, keep in touch with management, lots of phone calls?
Well, I would defer to the community in which these loved ones are living. Each state, county, has their own restrictions and guidelines that they have to follow. I can say, as someone who's worked in a skilled nursing facility and in several assisted livings, we do that kind of work because we care for older people.
Sure.
So put a tracking number on your package, drop it off at the front desk, or leave it and then call the community and say, hey, I just put something on the outside for my mom. Mail it to, like you are going to do, to a family friend. I would hope that is not typical, and that was not my experience. So I hate that package was lost. I hope it was not valuable.
Right.
Valuable memories, maybe. But you still need to send that stuff, and you need to Skype and send a card, send a letter, send pictures. Zoom is wonderful. If my parents can Zoom, then Zoom is great. And Skyping and FaceTime and FaceTime on the phone even.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And that is the trick, unfortunately, unless there's someone there to help. I don't know. My friends say the same thing with their parents and my folks. I mean, this thing's like a Rubik's Cube to my parents. They cannot figure out the cell phone aside from just dialing and answering, or a computer. It's just to that point now, and they are suffering some memory loss and some deficit along those lines. It's just real tricky for them. That's why I'm trying to think tangibly things they can hold, be it photographs or letters or phone calls. But certainly there can be people there also, I suppose, that can help them Skype or Zoom, like you said, which is the best. If they can see you one-on-one, that way I think it's just fantastic, don't you think?
Well, I think that's where we go back to physically distancing, but we can still be social. Mm-hmm. There was a community in Brentwood, and they had a parade. The residents sat outside, and family members were in their car, and they decorated their cars, and they drove around the parking lot and hung outside the windows, and were able to see their parents and grandparents. But it was safe. We can still be social. You can still go to the front porch and the sidewalk and see your loved one. You just can't go right in there for that big old bear hug if you've been shopping, and not taking precautions. So I wouldn't count out a visit, but you have to be safe. It's the safety part of life that we're having to deal with right now.
Tom, when you were talking earlier about the screening process and whether or not someone maybe would be helped by seeing a counselor or something along those lines, or a psychologist. I'm just curious, all I know is even before the pandemic hit, it seems like there's a real premium in getting an appointment these days with a psychologist, much less a psychiatrist. I mean, boy, if you want to talk about a career field to go into where you're going to be busy, that's one of them. Is that true? What have you noticed in terms of the services that are available and how easy it is to actually get in and to get an appointment? Or these days, I guess they do it electronically with a psychologist or a social worker.
Yeah, it's really interesting, just the timing of this pandemic. I mean, at least we have Zoom and FaceTime
Sure.
and some of these opportunities. Can you imagine if this would have happened 10 years ago and we'd just be so shut down and disconnected? But there is a healthcare shortage among behavioral health specialists in Tennessee. Only a third of our counties, 30 or so out of 95 counties, even have one psychiatrist. So we all need somebody to talk to. And fortunately now for telehealth, as long as you're licensed in Tennessee, you could be a psychologist or a social worker in North Carolina or in Washington State. And there are folks who are now really capitalizing on the ability to use telehealth in order to meet the demand of people who maybe need a counseling session, therapy. And, let me remind you, too, because I didn't know this, I'm not a clinician, but counseling, that type of therapy is actually an evidence-based practice. Counseling and going to see a counselor can actually change your cognitive brain. You can see changes in your brain from counseling. So, that type of therapy really does work when it comes to depression, anxiety, some different things that we're going through now and then. And I'm not talking about, things like schizophrenia and bipolar and some things that might be persistent. But, you think of times like this when there's a pandemic or a divorce or a job loss or essential workers. Even the state of Tennessee has established phone numbers that essential workers can call to get the help they need, being on the front lines. And if an essential worker needs it, I probably need it too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. So what you're saying is under these circumstances now, and because we've kind of had our hand forced, if you weren't able to get an appointment for a face-to-face locally here, even before the pandemic hit, telemed really makes, I didn't even really think about that. You're right. There's no reason if I needed to talk to a counselor, a qualified counselor, if there wasn't one available here, I could do it by telemed with someone in, Iowa, right?
That's right. And one number that I like to give out a lot, if you can text TN, like Tennessee, or just text help, but text it to 741-741. That's the crisis text line, and there's a trained crisis counselor available 24/7 if you just text TN to 741-741. And a crisis for someone may be I'm suicidal. A crisis for another one may be I need just some emotional assurance to get through the night or to get through the day. And just to know that there's somebody on the other end of a line willing to talk to you or text with you. I tell you, young people in particular have used this. But of course, the pandemic has really forced older adults to also start learning and utilizing texting and Zooming and technology. So I always give out that crisis text line.
That's a great idea. Lynn, what is the basic demographic these days of the typical caregiver? Age-wise, can you break it down? Is it more likely to be male or female? What are we seeing in terms of the typical caregiver?
Well, I think the typical caregiver is going to be a woman, but my father's a caregiver.
Okay.
I think that from my experience, I don't know that we can say what is typical, because there's younger onset of dementia, there's later onset, there's dementia as a symptom that could be attributed to 85 different things, and you might be a caregiver for just a snippet of time. It might not be a new way of life. So we do know that 1 in 8 people are dealing with someone who has Alzheimer's disease or a dementia symptom. So if you look around your neighborhood, the support is out there. You have to be willing to talk about it. And one of the things that I have found with caregiving support is that caregivers have found other caregivers because they have let go of that stigma of needing help. I need help. I'm going to ask for help. And then they have found support with another person. And I think that mental health in general, there is a stigma that we need to break down. And going back to your counseling, it's not just psychiatrists and psychologists. There's licensed clinical social workers, there's licensed counselors, there's counseling groups. So you can get some support, and they don't have to be an MD. They are still trained. A lot of our pastors and priests have some counseling, and our internal medicine doctors now are even having more mental health training that we didn't see, 30 years ago. So you have to ask. Don't be afraid to ask, because there's help out there, and we can get that help for you.
Yeah, those are all good options. A lot of people through their church potentially, and it doesn't have to be. You're right. Someone with an MD coming after their name. Let's take another phone call. We've got Ann. Ann, good morning. Hi, Ann.
Good morning.
Morning.
I have a daughter that has lived in New York this last 10 months that is normally a very strong, independent young lady that is suffering extreme PTSD and is getting help, but is coming back home to Tennessee hopefully this week. And I myself tried to be a strong individual, but have been extremely disappointed to find out that people with autoimmune, especially multiple autoimmune disorders, are probably going to be at the very bottom of the list for the vaccine, because I've been a shut-in for the last 10 months and have multiple autoimmune disorders. So any help and advice you could give to me as a mother that will be anxiously awaiting to see a daughter she hadn't seen in a year that's suffering. So any advice for me or for my child, I'll gracefully listen, because I know I'm not the only family that is in this predicament. And thanks, and have a good holiday.
Thank you, Ann. You too. It's nice to hear from you. And yeah, she loves her daughter a great deal. She talks to her as a regular caller to this show. And I'm sorry to hear that, but there's got to be ways they can make this work.
Yeah, I definitely think that just Ann's daughter coming home, them seeing each other, being together, again, as I mentioned near the beginning of the show, just that connectedness means so much. And I get that. And again, for those of us who can't be with family during this holiday, we have our pets, we have our faith communities, we have different support groups online. There's other ways to connect, even as Lynn did, sitting outside with her family, having dinner. I think that, when it comes to those types of resources when they're needed, again, that's what Mental Health America does. We love to connect people with all the different groups out there. If it's faith communities, support groups, NAMI, the Alzheimer's Foundation of America, that's part of what we do, is put you in touch with the right resources at the right time. So I would encourage you to connect with MHA of the Mid-South, Mental Health America of the Mid-South. I would also always promote our screenings, because that way you can kind of look and see, this isn't a survey in the back of a Cosmopolitan magazine. I mean, this is an evidence-based screening to look at, am I, possibly diagnosable for depression, anxiety, trauma, some of these things. And you can print those screenings out. They're anonymous, free, evidence-based. And on the back end, it then points you to local resources. And that's the thing about Mental Health America. We're local. I mean, we're not, serving folks in Chattanooga or Atlanta. We are here in Middle Tennessee, serving Middle Tennesseans. We've been here for 75 years, and there really is no health without mental health.
Before we go to break, Lynn, we want to share? Go ahead.
If I could address Ann, what I would suggest for her as someone who has had this question asked of me, I would set aside eating utensils, drinking utensils, some that are specific for her daughter and some that are specific, so that we can kind of make sure we're not crossing. I mean, I'm sure everybody's washing their dishes, but it's just one extra step. Same thing with linens, bars of soap, things of that nature, so that we're not sharing toothpaste. We each have our own. Of course, masks, wipes. There was a time when you could not find those things in the supermarkets, but now you can find hand sanitizer and Lysol and things of that nature. So, Miss Ann, I would encourage you to be excited about seeing your daughter, but just make sure that if you're going to hug when you first see her, both of you need to have a mask on. That would be my first thing, maybe two, just to be careful. But, and then just make sure you're using those universal precautions of washing your hands and not sharing and eating after each other and things of that nature. And I hope you have a wonderful Christmas and enjoy your time together.
Good tips, and I guarantee you, Ann will find a way. Listen, we'll take a break. We'll be back with our final segment right after this. Stay with us.